This Blessed Union by T-Drop. Narrated by Michael Hagiantonis. Short, deep grunts and sudden gasps echoed off the walls of a massive stone chamber. 3 of the walls were hewn from living rock, while the 4th was made entirely of glass and served as a colossal window. The light, pouring in from the marvel of craftsmanship, was so bright that there was no need for any other light source until the sun went down. This high up on the mountainside, there was plenty of sun, or blindingly white snow to light any of the rooms in Castle Thrak. Across the wide, empty floor, 2 men were sparring. Their breaths were bursting from them in harsh puffs of fog. They kept on, heedless of the cold as they fought, solid strikes landing against flesh time and again. Their shadows blurred and wavered against the far wall, cast onto the stone by the bright, atmospheric lighting. There was a beat when they separated on a mutual block and took a pause, steam curling from their limbs as they stood facing each other.
"That's all you got, you big ruffian?"
jeered the silver-haired man. His much larger opponent just shook his head and answered calmly,
"Don't waste my time with useless taunts."
"They can't be too useless if they finally kick you into a higher gear."
"Patience. I've only just warmed up."
The sparring began again in earnest, the tight sounds of effort and strikes coming faster and faster together. They continued even when the chamber door opened with a startling groan of ancient wood. A tall man entered, wearing light chainmail over his tunic, a sword hanging at his hip. He walked up to the edge of the enormous mat that spanned most of the floor, and stopped before his boots could touch it. "Pardon the interruption, Your Majesty." His polite words were tinged with amusement as he watched the display. The giant man repeatedly flung his opponents back with a set of complex blocking techniques. The smaller man took no time to recover, but kept darting back in, time after time, with rapid succession. "I bring news. Have you a moment?" There was a flash of green eyes in acknowledgement, lower canine fangs gleaming in a sudden snarl. In 2 precise movements, one huge hand snatched a tanned arm and twisted downward, forcing the smaller man to the floor. An equally huge knee pinned him at the base of his neck, while his wrists were clamped to his back by iron-strong fingers.
"I do now,"
King Reinhairs answered roughly, looking up.
"What news, Stephen?"
"Can't your damn politics wait?" cried the pinned man. "We're in the middle of a match here."
"We received a message from William McBray," Stephen said, ignoring the protest. "The Blue Arrow has left port in Oldonia, with King Theor and Prince Leonardo on board. It seems that Lord Isaac will not be joining them."
"That is surprising,"
said the king, jerking his head sharply to the side to toss long, fiery red bangs out of his eyes. His hands were still occupied. He could feel the smaller man squirming to loosen his grasp without success. "Yes, it seems that Prince Leonardo and Lord Isaac had a disagreement. William sounded quite tender on the prince's behalf regarding the matter." A flash of red light suddenly burst from the tanned man's captive hands, and King Reinhairs leapt back from him, the floor shaking as he landed. His hands ached briefly from the attack, tingling all the way down his arms to his elbows. The smaller man bounced up into a ready stance, knuckles cracking and setting off more miniature bursts of crimson light with each movement.
"I'm here to train, not to listen to your sappy international drama."
"Foul play, Zaf!" Stephen snapped at once, sharp and chiding. "No spells during hand-to-hand, you imbecile!" "Then let's make it a magic round," Zaf said, a challenge in his young stone-grey eyes. "That would be very irresponsible," warned Stephen sternly.
"Why? Even Master Shiosk says I'm nearly at my full potential. Are you afraid that I'll go too far and roast our precious king to cinders?"
Stephen scoffed at these words, but King Reinhairs mildly preened as he said,
I'm fairly certain Stephen was warning you for your own safety. I will have to decline your suggestion.
I thought as much,
Zaf taunted, in an overly disappointed tone.
You'd probably just wrap up in a warding circle. Honestly, why don't you show me your outrageous offensive magic one of these days?
You could stand to learn a thing or two about defensive circles and warding spells, Stephen interjected, clearly frustrated by Zaf's disrespect. There is more successful strategy beyond charging in for the attack.
And what better way to learn than trying to deflect the legendary fire blades that lurk in our king's Faeblood veins?
It was all King Reinhairs could do not to roll his eyes, as if he hadn't been hounded about this topic his entire life. The temptation to show people what they demanded to see was sometimes a sweeter prospect than the repetitive pestering after 30 years.
They are far from being actual blades of fire that sheath into my veins,
he said, to damp Zaf's interest.
That is a mere rumor.
Your Majesty, feel no obligation to explain your gifts, Stephen said heatedly. And you, Zaf, are you delusional enough to think he would ever show such a miracle to you? Or that you would even survive? It would be wasted on the likes of such a foul, barbaric... King Reinhairs clapped his hands together so hard that a loud snap of sound cut Stephen off. He then smiled and said, quietly and politely,
Zaf, I believe this is a good stopping point. Thank you for being my opponent today.
He waited for any sign of further resistance, but Zaf's mouth only twisted to one side in an indignant pout. With a heavy sigh and a quick bow, he headed for the door at a brisk pace. Stephen turned to watch him go, and once the door was closed, his posture relaxed into something more casual. He crossed his arms and shook his head, his speech shifting into informality.
Klaus, I know you brought him on in good faith, but I can't envision that oaf as Kingdom Mage. He's far too young, reckless, and arrogant.
That does not equate to uselessness,
the king said, plucking a large towel from off a rack and patting at his sweat-dampened brow and neck.
He has proven himself a loyal subject in spite of his posturing and crude nature. I have faith that he is worthy of consideration.
If it were up to me, I'd choose any of the other candidates and the consequences in a heartbeat.
Klaus von Reinhairs strode towards the giant glass wall, and Stephen followed him. They looked out for a silent moment on the swirling haze of scattered snowfall. Through it, they could see the entirety of Thrak, laid out below them. Stone buildings and homes stretching from the massive core of the mountainside, down along the rocky roots, and out onto the plains. From this height, the distant outer wall dividing the city from the empty stretch of flatlands appeared as nothing but toy building blocks.
It will be many years yet before the succession of mages,
Klaus finally said.
I am holding out hope that someone with such raw magical talent can be shaped into using it productively by Master Shiosk.
This isn't a school, Stephen almost grumbled. Our kingdom mage of over 3 generations isn't a professor taking in any vagrant off the street. His limited remaining time should be spent on worthy candidates with noble hearts.
I believe that Zaf is noble,
Klaus said firmly.
In his own way. For all his arrogance and attitude, he does what is right when pressed. I also feel it will be impossible for Zaf to not have matured somewhat by the time the decision needs to be made. Whether I am right or wrong, there are still the other candidates to consider. Until then, my decision stands, Stephen. We are not going to throw him out. Please make peace with it, rather than complaining.
Is that an order, Your Majesty?
Stephen asked with a grin. Klaus sat heavily on one of the giant stone benches before the glass wall.
It's a suggestion from a friend,
he answered, purposefully informal to stress his point. He habitually remained formal, even in casual settings, to his own annoyance. Stephen nodded in understanding. Klaus valued Stephen's loyalty and friendship in all things, but there were times when he had to pull rank to quiet a disagreement. He tapped his hand on the short metal pillar that sat between the benches, holding a set of rune words in his mind. The pillar began to glow orange beneath the built-in grating, and ripples of heat began flowing from it at his silent command.
I came here to speak with you about something else entirely, Stephen admitted.
Feeling slightly apprehensive, Klaus inclined his head to invite Stephen to sit. He did, taking up the next bench over.
You should be discussing this marriage proposal more thoroughly with your advisors. We are all unsettled by how tight-lipped you've been on the subject. Presumably, since you signed off on the negotiations, you must be considering it. But without more transparency on your part, we're of no help.
Klaus ceased rubbing down his limbs, resting the towel in his lap, and staring out through the massive window. He'd wondered how long he could avoid the topic. Their boyhood bond made him think Stephen might tease him about it in a private moment like this one. He tried to keep the discussion serious.
I am unsure about this, Stephen. I support this merger in theory. King Theor was not blowing dust in our faces with the proposal. However, there are many other factors that make me hesitant.
Stephen's eyebrow quirked up a bit, and his face turned sly. Klaus felt he'd already failed to dodge the incoming teasing. Thankfully it was mild.
I may be your knight rather than an advisor, but I know you, Klaus. I can tell that you bristled the moment this proposal was received. To guess, I'd say your first thought was of the other intended party's willingness.
You've hit close to the mark,
admitted Klaus.
But it goes beyond that. Anyone with a mild understanding of recent Uldonian history can see that Prince Leonardo is clearly a pawn for his father's gains. The issue is, those gains are not unfounded. It makes trusting King Theo and understanding his motives extremely difficult.
I'm glad to hear you say that. I also understand your hesitation, as does your entire council. However, this matter might be one in which duty must come before emotion.
Klaus swiftly wiped at his face, then reached for something that had been resting on the bench before he sat down. It was a small, structured leather case, and he opened it to retrieve a pair of square spectacles. He slid them on now that his sparring was over, and adjusted them as he answered.
I am aware of my duty. My entire reign has been centered on solidifying peace between our countries. I brought this upon myself, exhibiting such a strong conviction in such a grand way. Yet for all my schooling in strategy and mental prowess, I'd never considered an arranged marriage to anyone from Moldonia, let alone an heir of King Theor's.
You are not to blame, Stephen insisted. No one in your council thought of it either. King Theor was as good as childless until a month ago. No one would have thought he'd pluck his long-lost son out of the woodwork just to make this proposal a possibility. It could be argued that alone is proof that he desires peace just as desperately as we do.
He hasn't publicly reinstated Leonardo yet,
Klaus said suspiciously.
It makes me dreadfully uneasy that he is staking the official status of his son's royalty on my response. It is quite suspect, considering how strongly King Theor denounced Prince Leonardo until it was convenient. Using one's own flesh and blood as an easily discarded tool to simply polish up if all other options run out. I have no love for such a callous mindset.
Stephen crossed his long legs, leaning back on his hands. Even with the heat radiating off the pillar, his words produced cold wisps of mist as he spoke.
You're not alone. You've heard how suspicious your counselors are of the convenience of it all. But in my opinion, callous or not, King Theor is sincere in his intentions. Moral quandary for political benefits aside, I think the real potential trouble lies with the Eldonian citizens. They are still quite wary of Faeblood due to their superstitions, otherwise Prince Leonardo would never have been cast off to begin with. It's doubtful whether they will accept this as a true symbol of peace, or a cold and calculated political move. For all we know, it could cause massive unrest. King Theor might be gambling with more than he knows.
He knows, Klaus sneered. If I understand him at all, he's convinced that the people's loyalty to their king is stronger than their superstitious fears. He seems the type to encourage blind loyalty. I feel that the majority of the aversion to Faeblood in Eldonia is more in compliance with rulers like Theor, rather than the true beliefs of the people.
An uncontrollable chortle burst out in a misty stream from Stephen's smiling lips. Klaus could see frost forming on the man's booted feet and curling around his mouth briefly. Forgive me, Klaus, but you're sounding a touch naive. Fears born of folklore as old as Faeblood run too deep to be influenced by a mere human authority figure. Just because our country managed to shake off the same mantle of prejudice far sooner than Eldonia, doesn't mean it was an easy feat, or a swift one. How many centuries did it take for opinions on Faeblood to shift from cursed to blessed?
More than was necessary,
Klaus conceded.
But forward-thinking Sparian leaders are largely responsible for shaping the public's mind on the issue.
Stephen nodded his head in mild agreement, and they sat there for another moment without speaking. Not long after, Stephen's lips were curling up once more as he asked, teasingly, "You're not putting off discussing this in council because you're secretly shy about marrying a stranger, are you?" Klaus shifted uncomfortably, beginning to rub his legs again with the towel. He'd known it was only a matter of time. Stephen grinned wider. "I'm right, aren't I?"
"Only in part,"
Klaus answered quietly. Marriage was the one aspect of being king that he dreaded for years.
"I'm not the most romantic person, nor the most trusting. It seemed an impossible feat to bind myself to another person for life."
"This is why your courting escapades always end abruptly, Klaus." Stephen almost groaned. "How can you even know if you're romantic without at least attempting to grow close to any suitors?" Klaus gave a small chuckle and rubbed his hands together over the small heating pillar.
"That is quite unfair, Stephen. I've made many attempts since I came of age."
"If you can call them attempts."
"I would, absolutely,"
Klaus said defensively. "You gave up on Prince Fiori within a single day, Your Majesty."
"Do not try to blame me for that failure, Stephen. He was insufferable to my servants, and to anyone else not directly associated with me. Respect for others is the least I can ask of a potential partner."
"And Princess Selora?" Stephen asked, clearly enjoying himself. "You made it a whole week courting her. I even recall a few moments where I thought you two were connecting quite well. A union with the West would have been so divine for the import of leather goods." Klaus shook his head at his friend's heartless teasing.
"I told you that she was desperately in love with another in her own country. I told you that she was desperately in love with another in her own country. I would never want to tear them apart for something as shallow as leather trade, you fiend."
"Yet she came here of her own free will," Stephen pointed out. "I still maintain that you should have just married her and brought her beloved to live here as a third. She genuinely seemed to care about you both, which is more than I can say of anyone else who's tried winning you over."
"Not all ideal situations are possible,"
Klaus countered wearily.
"I could not have judged after one short week whether I wanted to be bound to her, on her own merits, let alone another's as well. Even if I could have been so perceptive, I could not overlook how opposed her existing partner was to the prospect of becoming a third. I could see that Salora was not at peace with the situation, and I did not want to be responsible for creating such a rift.
Your infuriating ideals practically ensure that you'll be alone for the rest of your life, Stephen declared, frustrated. Marquise Telenor was too timid and fragile. Lord Kinra was not inclined toward men. Sir Morad had conflicting political views. Lady Shaim was—
I see your point,
Klaus interrupted, but Stephen kept going. I hate to inform you of the obvious, Klaus, but you're a royal. You cannot have some commonplace romantic courtship and marriage. Anyone you marry will be for one political reason or another, and there's nothing you can do to shield them from that. You will have to compromise somewhere, and accept whatever consequences come from it. Even marriages built on sheer love must face the same risk in the beginning. Klaus's voice was firm when he spoke.
That is why I had almost resigned myself to never marrying, and choosing a younger ward to take as my heir instead.
Stephen actually laughed at him. Being dead set on the loner life at 28, that seems a bleak mindset, my friend.
I would rather be uncommitted than courting someone who cares nothing for me, or would be negatively impacted as a result,
Klaus said simply.
Which is why this proposal troubles me more than any other prospect I've had in the past. Unfortunately, as you said, this time I may be forced to put aside my personal convictions for the sake of the greater good.
You speak as though being married is, in and of itself, a death sentence, Stephen pointed out. Remember, you are not required to breathe each other's air every hour of the day. You'll both retain your independence within the marriage. It's a fairly benign arrangement. Klaus chuckled ironically and smiled. His fangs bared slightly with the expression.
While that is true, do not forget how much easier it may appear from our Sparian perspective. A political marriage will impact my own life very little. I am not the one being uprooted and planted into new soil. Prince Leonardo is the one facing the transplant shock.
Gardening parallels are the quickest way for you to lose my interest.
Forgive me for retreating into a familiar topic, Klaus said with a little smirk. Can you scoff at the comparison?
I suppose not, Stephen answered fondly. But maybe try to avoid doing that around our guests once they're here. I don't think they'd appreciate it. Klaus didn't respond for a moment, continuing to warm his hands while thinking.
Putting aside politics, peace, and international relations, I do worry about Prince Leonardo in particular. He's been trampled and cast out by his country and his father, and now he is being offered to me as a glorified political bribe. How could he not already disdain me for thinking of accepting it?
Are you concerned he might not favor you enough after that? Stephen badgered lightly, before becoming serious again and assuring, this is all conjecture until we learn more about him. He's been hidden away for so long that we're without the advantage of knowing him as a fellow royal, like we know all your other suitors. Everyone is keen to hear him speak during the declarations of intent, if not to actually hear his viewpoint, to simply find out more about him. Nothing is yet set in stone. He may straight out refuse, and that will be the end of it. On a personal note, Klaus, I think any disdain he may feel would be toward King Theor rather than you, but, again, conjecture.
It is only conjecture to a certain point, Klaus said. Some facts are bound to be truth. Prince Leonardo cannot be any happier about this than I am. As for his feelings on the good it may do our countries, they can only be speculated upon.
The glass of the massive wall suddenly rattled in the intricate metal frameworks, as a strong tunnel of wind slammed into the mountainside. It brought with it a giant, blinding wall of snow so dense and cold that it sounded like fine pebbles blasting against the glass. The entire chamber darkened completely during the several long moments of rumbling, snowy onslaught. The light returned as swiftly as it had been blocked out, when the wind finally died out and the view was clear once more. The silence that followed was almost unnerving after the loud rush of wind and snow and straining glass. A few delicate clumps of snow stuck to the window or floated from one pane to the next. Stephen whistled admiringly. It's been a while since I've seen a rogue snow channel break against the window. Perhaps I should spend more time here. That was exhilarating.
You should see it during a sparring session, Klaus said smugly. The sudden distraction and darkness make an excellent challenge.
Well, seeing as how your session is now over. Stephen stood up, his speech becoming formal once more. I must advise you to return to your room, if only briefly. Valkia has been rather irritable in your absence. Klaus's heart skipped a bit quicker, and a subtle longing that he'd pushed back with sparring grew louder within him. He rose from the bench at once, heading for the chamber door. His tone was soft as he replied,
We have been apart too long for my liking as well. Today has been excessively busy, but thank the gods it is almost over.
Only one more instructional before dinner, and your evening will be free, Stephen encouraged. You can endure, my friend.
Still,
Klaus rumbled, as they entered a long windowless tunnel, lit with stones overhead.
I'll go to Valkia first, as you suggest.
Thank you, Stephen said, relieved. She has been pacing a trench through your floor. It is setting your room attendant's nerves on edge.
All will be right soon. She will relax once I'm there, as will I.
Klaus's tone held a quiet, tangible need.
I need to curl up with her beside me. Just a few minutes will be enough, if that is all we have until tonight.
Stephen hummed in warm agreement. I swear, when she is by your side, you shed stress like an oiled glove sheds water. The larger man gave a soft smile.
Is it any wonder why I love her so?